My name is Lance Peterman. I wear a number of hats. By day, I am the Director of Identity and Access Management at Equitable. It's financial services industry, so it comes with all of those trappings. In addition to that, I am also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I teach software architecture and design, but I'm also bridging out into hopefully getting identity adopted as a curriculum, not just at Charlotte, but hopefully other universities over time. And then because apparently I have a little bit more spare time, I am also a precinct judge. And I just wrapped up, thankfully, the 2022 election season. This has been interesting because we actually had not one, but two primaries. And so it's
Nice.
uh, it's been an interesting season. But yeah, and so I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have a small horse farm here. That's where most of my Pam stories come from, is talking about the horses. And we live here, and it's a great life.
I forgot to ask about the horses. How are the horses doing, by the way?
Well, they're not loving life today because Nicole just came through. But the pasture is a little muddy, but otherwise they're doing really well.
Okay. Yeah, man. And I gotta make it through there and ride. So
Yeah, you're welcome to stop by, man. What's interesting about PAM, and I'll use that acronym pretty regularly just because it's easier to use than privilege and
yeah.
access management. What's interesting about PAM is most organizations come into identity through one of two vectors traditionally. One is the traditional onboarding experience. How do I get my employees and consultants up and running as quickly as possible? And then the other is the regulatory side, particularly Sarbanes-Oxley from a U.S. perspective, but obviously internationally it happens as well. And usually that's from a Sarbanes-Oxley, it's the question of what systems affect your financial reporting and who has access to those systems. And so that's the initial vector that gets identity its funding, and it's valuable in that respect. What's interesting is once you kind of get beyond that, it's a different world. But when we're talking privileged access, a lot of people are like, well, what's privilege? And that can be its own podcast by itself, honestly. But I discuss privilege in two basic definitional categories. The first one is the conventional definition, and that is all of the accounts on a given system, and I'll use system in a very broad sense, that have any type of elevated capability of altering the functions or features of a system. And traditionally, like in a Windows scenario, it's all your Windows default accounts, and then you get into the application layer and you get beyond that. And then the other piece that comes out of this is it's the one that I like to talk more with my customers about is it's what are your accounts that have high risk in your organization if they're compromised? Because this is where the definition gets a little bit different. And this is a very timely subject given some of the issues that we're having on Twitter today, for example. One of the things that I have talked with my business stakeholders is early on in the PAM program is who manages your social media accounts? Because we don't think of those in obviously the traditional PAM mindset, but Eli Lilly just had their stock price drop because somebody was impersonating their account on Twitter. And that obviously was beyond their control, but it does give you a sense of what the nature of privilege is in that respect. Now, obviously, most
Right.
PAM programs are going to focus on the first definition, certainly out of the gate, and that's appropriate. You want to find your systems that have the highest risk. If this system is compromised, what could do the most damage to the company? And then you start. That's where you get into okay. I've gone out, I've bought a tool instead of that tool, sitting in a closet somewhere, which unfortunately happens to a lot of companies. When we start rolling it out, who do we start rolling it out to first? And my recommendation first is come up with a priority list of your systems, and hopefully you've already done this. So this isn't a new exercise because any company that, for example, has a business continuity planning or disaster recovery work, they know which systems matter the most to them. And so you can start with those. And so that's kind of an early vector into PAM. And it's the one easiest to understand when you start talking with your stakeholders. if you're in a Linux environment, where are your root accounts stored? And then when you're implementing PAM, that's where you want to get into, well, how do we manage these accounts in a fashion that achieve a high level of security, but you're also balancing that, that continuum of security and convenience. Now, when you're inconveniencing IT people, it's a little bit more tolerable and forgivable than when you're inconveniencing business people.
Right.
But if you make your sysadmins mad, they can push back a little bit as well. So, yeah, this is obviously the classic security conundrum, and
Right.
I obviously have to borrow a horse analogy, although it does get used in security. One of the trainers that I've followed and has been in the industry for decades once said, when you're working with a horse, or when you're working with your users, you want to make the right thing easy and you want to make the wrong thing hard.
Hmm.
And I think that's a great modality to go with when you're trying to deploy these things. So something as simple as someone needing to get access to a Windows admin account, there needs to be some friction there. I certainly want to make it, for example, your access to it needs to require strong authentication. So it's not just username and password. It also should not be tied in any remote fashion to your primary identity, in my opinion. The analogy I use is if that account can send email, it should not be managing servers.
Right.
And so I definitely subscribe to that. Now, within that definition, we can look for things that, especially from an automation perspective, that can hopefully make those a little bit easier. And the easiest analogy I can think of is, like, if there's a server that I access on a regular basis to do configuration management, do builds, things of that nature, instead of making that person go through a web interface to check out the credential and then they have to throw it into a config file or something, if there's something that I can do to automate that process to where maybe just clicking on an RDP icon can automatically call my privileged access management service, let me log in, accept a second factor, and boom, I'm in, I'm ready to go. That's that's what I mean by that balancing act.
Yeah.
And it's tough to do when you first roll out a PAM program. But most of the vendors in this space nowadays know that if you don't, err on the side of helping your admins and your developers out, adoption rates will be lower than they should be, and then you wind up with more risk. On the good side of things, what that results in, ideally, less often is, for example, you're not storing passwords or credentials in text files, which is a major no-no for any PAM program. But at the same time, and I'll use CyberArk as an example, they saw that, several years ago when they went out and bought Chef. And so we're not Chef, Conjure. Sorry.
Conjure. Yep.
My brain has those crosswired, but they went out and they bought Conjure because they recognized that secrets management was kind of that next frontier. And they're not the only vendor to do this.
Right.
Shoot, even 1Password nowadays has secret management, so everybody's trying to get into that space. And it's that recognition that you need to go where your privileged accounts are, and now it's it's building software. And so that's certainly been a big part of it. And I think the other piece with the move to the cloud is the conventional privileged access management programs, and some of my friends at Amazon would challenge me on this, or have challenged me on this, is some of the patterns that were used are, they would call them arcane. And what I mean by that is things like privileged session management, for example. That was one of the hallmarks of your conventional privileged access management solution, was the ability to have the PAM platform manage the session that the admin or the DBA or developer was invoking. And management included the ability to record that session. And
Right.
so auditors loved that because you could go back and look at exactly what the developer did. You could even record some of the keystrokes. and things of that nature. And those were great. And what has happened with the move to the cloud is that's becoming kind of, I'm not going to say it's an arcane pattern, but it's definitely, it needs to share the road a little bit with, I'll call them the bicyclists. And that is, it's the just in time group. And basically what that is the group that says, let me elevate when I need that access.
Right.
And then once I'm done with that access, take it away. And so you wind up with the concept of zero standing privilege, which is a great state to be in. That way a hacker can't pop in and go, okay, I'm automatically going to take advantage of the privileges that this account has. Well, from a standing perspective, that account doesn't have any privileges. So you got to go play ball in
Right.
a PAM solution or whatever, cloud-based solution you're working with to achieve that. So I think that's a really interesting space. And there's some great vendors that are doing some really cool things in that space that I think, honestly, I think that's long term, that's where we're going to move into, is more of the JIT or just in time privileged access.
Yeah. So we'll wrap up with this, right? So if you're watching this, they're like, okay, awesome. And they are getting ready to go on their PAM journey, right? They, young man or young woman has been given the fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, job privilege access management. It's your job to go fix it and roll this out. What are some keys to start this process?
I think developing relationships early, more often than not, somebody who hasn't talked to the business about this has bought this product that you're going to be stuck with at the beginning. And so I would say making, hopefully you have an identity program before this. If you don't, then relationships are critical to any of your success, because if you start telling IT, hey, we're going to start managing your accounts, they're like, yeah, I got other things to worry about, go away. But the other piece I would say, and it's definitely related to that, is for privileged access, because you have to have buy-in from IT and from your stakeholders. This is one of those areas where it cannot be done at the grassroots level. It has to start with leadership at the senior level, and it has to start with policy. You have to have a policy that says, this is how we're going to manage privileged access in our environment. And then you start applying that policy to the various constituencies that you're working with. If you don't have those things, your success is going to be really short. You're just not going to achieve a lot of your objectives, because you have to have buy-in from everybody.
Right, Lance, this has been a blast, man. Try to keep these things short.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I appreciate it, David. Thank you for having me on. Happy to talk about this anytime. If people are looking for, kind of how do I crack this nut from a non-vendor perspective, I do have a couple of conference presentations on YouTube. I got Twitter on the brain with the dumpster fire that's going on there right now. But some of those presentations are on YouTube. Might be a good way to kind of ease themselves into it.
Okay, there we go.
Thanks, David.